The long way west, the train did not arrive with urgency. It sighed into the platform at Amtrak California Zephyr as though it had been travelling for 100 years and intended to continue for 100 more, indifferent to clocks, immune to the nervous glances of the travellers checking their phones. Edith stood a little apart from the others, her gloved hands folded around the handle of a modest navy suitcase, watching the long silver body settle into stillness. She had always believed that departures should feel ceremonial. There should be a sense of crossing a threshold, of stepping from one life into another. Instead, Union Station hummed with a distracted modern rhythm. Rolling luggage, clipped announcements, glowing screens reflected in tired eyes. It made her feel, not for the first time, that the world had hurried ahead and left her standing politely behind. At 62, Edith had the sort of presence that did not demand attention but quietly rewarded it. Her hair, once a deep chestnut, now softened into a dignified silver, pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. She wore a wool coat the colour of autumn leaves, though the air inside the station was warm. Her movements were careful, but not frail, deliberate in a way that suggested she had learned to conserve energy rather than spend it freely. When she spoke, which she had not yet done that morning, her voice carried a gentle steadiness, the kind one might associate with reading aloud in a quiet room. She inhaled slowly, and beneath the metallic scent of the train and the faint oiliness of machinery, she caught something else, coffee, strong and slightly burnt, drifting from somewhere unseen. It reminded her of mornings long ago when her husband would rise before her and let the percolator sputter to life. That smell had once meant continuity. Now it meant memory. First time, a porter asked, not unkindly. She nodded. Best way to see the country, he said. Take your time with it. Take your time. The phrase lingered with her as she stepped aboard. Inside the air was warmer, softer. The muted creak of leather seats accompanied the gentle murmur of passengers settling in. Edith paused just beyond the threshold, letting her eyes adjust, letting the moment stretch. This, she thought, was the beginning, though she could not yet say of what. Her seat was by the window. She placed her bag overhead with a slight effort, then sat, smoothing her skirt, as though someone might be watching. Outside, Chicago remained brisk and unyielding, its buildings standing in orderly defiance of the wind. Inside, the train held a different tempo altogether, a quiet promise of distance, of time elongated. As the train began to move, not abruptly, but with a gradual gathering of purpose, Edith felt a subtle shift within herself, like a door opening just enough to let in a draught. She had sold the house 3 weeks earlier. Even now the thought did not feel entirely real. The house had stood for nearly 40 years in a suburb where everything seemed arranged for permanence. Lawns trimmed to identical lengths, mailboxes upright and patient, neighbours who waved with reliable familiarity. Within those walls she had lived a life that had once seemed complete. Dinners at 6, television in the evenings, conversations that filled the quiet spaces. After her husband's death, the rooms had grown larger, not physically, but perceptibly, hallways stretched, ceilings lifted, and the silence acquired weight. At first, she had tried to maintain everything exactly as it had been, but over time the sameness began to feel less like comfort and more like a kind of stillness that resisted life. Selling the house had not been a dramatic decision. There had been no sudden revelation. Instead, it had unfolded slowly, like the turning of a season. Papers signed, keys handed over, photographs packed away. And then, unexpectedly, nothing. No schedule, no one waiting. It was that absence that had brought her here. The train curved out of the city, and the buildings gave way to stretches of industrial edges, then suburbs, then something quieter. Edith rested her hand lightly against the window. It was cool to the touch, grounding. A man across the aisle fumbled with his phone, muttering under his breath. "These things," he said to no one in particular, "have more opinions than I do." Edith allowed herself a small smile. She did not own a smartphone. Her daughter had insisted, had even purchased one for her, but it remained in its box on a shelf, unopened. The idea of learning an entirely new language of swipes and taps felt less like progress and more like surrender. The man noticed her glance. "You have one of these?" he asked, holding up the device as though it were mildly suspicious. "No," Edith replied. "Lucky you," he said. There was a pause, a brief moment in which conversation might have continued. Instead, it faded, as such moments often do among strangers. Edith leaned back, listening. The rhythm of the train, steady, insistent, began to assert itself beneath all other sounds. It was not loud, but it was constant, a quiet percussion that seemed to synchronize with her breathing. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting it settle into her bones. She had not travelled alone in over 30 years. The realization arrived not as fear, but as a kind of awareness, like stepping into a room and noticing the light has changed. She did not know what lay ahead. Not the landscapes, not the people, not the version of herself she might encounter along the way. She opened her eyes. Outside, the world was already shifting, the city receding, the horizon widening. The train moved forward without hesitation, carrying her with it, whether she felt ready or not. And somewhere, beneath the quiet apprehension, beneath the careful composure she had worn for so long, there was something else, a faint, unfamiliar sensation, possibility. But as Edith watched the landscape blur into something new, a question settled gently, persistently into her thoughts. Had she begun this journey to discover the world beyond her past, or to uncover something within it she had never truly seen? The announcement came just before noon, delivered in a voice both courteous and practised, as though it had guided countless travellers through similar transitions. Dining car reservations are now open. Please see the attendant for seating. As a reminder, we operate under a shared table policy. Guests may be seated together to ensure everyone is accommodated. Edith hesitated. She had read about this, the necessity of strangers sharing a table, the enforced proximity of conversation. It was, she supposed, a sensible arrangement. And yet, the idea of sitting with unfamiliar people, of speaking without preparation or purpose, stirred something uneasy within her. Still, she rose. The dining car was brighter than she expected, sunlight streaming through wide windows and catching the polished surfaces of the tables. There was a faint clatter of dishes, the low hum of voices, and beneath it all the steady rhythm of the train, always present, like a second heartbeat. The attendant gestured. "Right this way, ma'am." She was led to a table already partially occupied. A man sat facing the window, his posture slightly rigid, as though he had once been accustomed to standing at attention and had not entirely unlearned it. His hands, broad, weathered, rested near a wooden toolbox placed carefully beside his seat. Across from him, a woman leaned back with easy familiarity, her scarf loosely draped, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Looks like we're filling up," the woman said warmly. Edith nodded, offering a small, polite smile as she took her seat. "Frank," the man said, with a brief incline of his head. "Edith?" she replied. "Sarah," said the woman, extending her hand. There was one empty seat remaining. It was filled moments later by a man who carried himself with a certain quiet deliberation, as though each movement had been considered before execution. He removed his jacket before sitting, folding it neatly over the back of his chair. "Marcus," he said simply. Menus were distributed. For a moment the table fell into a comfortable if tentative silence, the kind that accompanies beginnings. Edith became aware of the textures around her, the smoothness of the table beneath her fingertips, the slight give of the seat, the warmth of the air carrying the scent of eggs, coffee, and something faintly sweet. "First time on this route?" Sarah asked, her tone inviting rather than intrusive. "Yes," Edith said. "And yours?" "Oh, I've done parts of it before," Sarah replied, "but never the whole stretch. Felt like time to see what's in between." Frank gave a soft snort. "Everything's in between," he said. "That's where life happens." Marcus glanced up from the menu. "Spoken like a man who has spent time observing rather than rushing." Frank shrugged. "Or fixing things no one else noticed were broken." The waitress arrived and orders were placed: omelettes, bacon, coffee, the classics. Edith found comfort in the familiarity of it, in the ritual of a shared meal that required no explanation. "Do you travel often?" Marcus asked Edith. "No," she said, "not alone." There it was, said plainly. "And now you are," Sarah observed, not as a question, but as a recognition. Edith inclined her head. "Yes." Frank tapped the side of his toolbox lightly. "First time's the hardest," he said. "After that, you just keep going." There was something in his tone, not encouragement exactly, but certainty. "And you?" Edith asked, surprising herself. "Me?" Frank leaned back slightly. "I fix things, or I used to. Figured I'd take one last ride before I run out of places to go." Sarah smiled. "That sounds suspiciously like the beginning of a novel." "Or the end," Marcus added dryly. They laughed softly. The food arrived, and with it a shift. Eating together created its own kind of ease, a shared rhythm of gestures and pauses. Coffee was poured, plates were passed. "You know," Sarah said, "my daughter tried to teach me how to order groceries through an app. Said it would change my life." "And did it?" Marcus asked. Yes, Sarah replied. I'm now spend twice as long staring at a screen instead of walking through a market. Frank chuckled. My grandson told me I should get one of those watches that counts your steps. I told him I already know how many steps I take. Enough. Edith listened, her smile growing more natural. My daughter bought me a phone, she said quietly. I have not opened it. Keep it that way, Frank said. Or open it, Marcus countered, but on your terms. Sarah lifted her coffee cup. To doing things on our own terms, she said. They all raised their cups, almost instinctively. The train moved steadily onward, carrying them through landscapes not yet fully revealed. Outside the light shifted, the horizon stretching further with each passing mile. Inside something else was beginning. As the conversation continued, Edith felt a subtle loosening within herself, not dramatic, not immediate, but present. The edges of her solitude seemed, if only slightly, less defined. Yet as she listened, really listened, to the cadence of their voices, to the small disclosures tucked between casual remarks, she sensed that each of them carried something unspoken, something waiting just beneath the surface. And as the train pressed forward into the widening afternoon, a quiet thought emerged, uninvited but insistent. What had brought each of them here? And what, if anything, were they still searching for? The observation car felt like a suspended moment between places, as though it belonged neither to departure nor arrival, but to something quieter, the act of passing through. Edith arrived there in the early afternoon, guided partly by curiosity and partly by a need she could not yet name. The car opened into a wide glass-domed space where light poured in without restraint, illuminating everything with a kind of honest clarity. The seats, deep, curved, upholstered in worn leather, creaked softly as passengers shifted, the sound reminiscent of old libraries and patient rooms. She chose a seat near the window, though in truth every seat seemed to belong to the window. The world stretched outward in a widening panorama, the land flattening into long amber fields touched by autumn's careful hand. The colours were not loud, but layered, ochre, rust, pale gold, like a painting that revealed itself slowly the longer one looked. Edith placed her hands on the armrests and felt the subtle vibration of the train beneath her palms. It was steady, reassuring. She had begun to recognize its rhythm, not consciously, but in the way her body adjusted to it, as though it had always known this motion. A man nearby turned a page. The sound caught her attention, not because it was loud, but because it was distinct. Paper, not glass. She glanced over. Marcus sat a few seats away, a book open in his hands. Not a sleek device, but a worn hardcover, its edges softened by time. There was something deliberate in the way he held it, something almost reverent. "You prefer paper?" Edith said, before she had quite decided to speak. He looked up, not startled, but as though returning from a distance. "I do," he replied. "It asks more of you. Attention, patience. It doesn't glow or insist." Edith nodded. "My husband used to say that books had a scent that told you how they had lived," she said. "Old paper, dust, sometimes even a trace of someone's home." Marcus considered this. "And what does that one say?" he asked. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "That it has been kept, not discarded." He closed the book gently, marking his place with a finger. "There's a difference," he said, "between keeping something and holding on to it." The distinction lingered. Outside, the landscape shifted almost imperceptibly, the fields giving way to low rises, the horizon beginning to gather texture. The sky, vast and unbroken, reflected itself in the windows, merging interior and exterior into something indistinct. Sarah appeared moments later, her presence announced not by sound, but by a subtle change in energy, lighter, warmer. "There you both are," she said, settling into a seat across from them. "I was beginning to think everyone had disappeared into their own thoughts." "Some of us have," Marcus replied. "Dangerous place," Sarah said lightly. "Too many echoes." Edith observed her more closely now. There was a looseness to Sarah's movements, an ease that suggested she had learned, perhaps recently, to inhabit her own space without apology. Her scarf, deep red, patterned with faint gold lines, caught the light as she shifted, drawing the eye without demanding it. "I used to paint landscapes like this," Sarah said, gesturing toward the window. "Or at least I tried to. But they always came out too precise." "Too precise?" Edith echoed. "Yes," Sarah said, "as if I were trying to prove something rather than see it." "And now?" Marcus asked. "Now I paint things I don't fully understand," she said. "It feels more honest." Frank joined them without announcement, lowering himself into a seat with the quiet solidity of someone accustomed to occupying space without seeking permission. The wooden toolbox remained with him, placed carefully at his feet. "What's honest?" he asked. "Not knowing," Sarah replied. Frank considered this, then gave a small approving nod. "Most people pretend they know everything," he said. "Makes them useless when something actually breaks." Edith glanced at the toolbox. "You keep that with you always?" she asked. Frank followed her gaze. "Habit," he said. "Tools are like words. If you don't carry them, you forget how to use them." There was a pause, not uncomfortable but full. The train curved slightly, and the light shifted across their faces, catching in the fine lines that time had etched, not harshly, but with a kind of quiet precision. Edith became aware of her own reflection, faintly layered over the landscape beyond the glass. For a moment, she saw herself as both part of the scene and separate from it. Invisible, she had thought, but here, in this suspended space, among these near strangers, she felt something else, not visibility exactly, but presence. The train's rhythm deepened as it moved onward, the sound of the rails beneath them growing more pronounced, almost musical. Somewhere in the car, someone adjusted a seat, and the leather responded with a soft, familiar groan. Marcus reopened his book. Sarah leaned back, watching the sky. Frank rested his hand briefly on the lid of his toolbox, as though confirming its continued existence. And Edith, sitting between memory and motion, found herself wondering, not for the first time, but with new clarity, if she had spent so many years holding on to what had been, what might happen if she began, even slightly to let herself move forward. By late afternoon, the air within the train had taken on a deeper warmth, the kind that settles gradually and makes one aware of the contrast only when it is briefly disturbed. Outside, the landscape had risen into something more deliberate, hills becoming mountains, distances compressing into sharper forms. An announcement came, carrying a note of anticipation. "We will soon be entering the Moffat Tunnel. Please remain seated." The name itself seemed to gather attention. Passengers shifted, some leaning closer to the windows, others settling more firmly into their seats. The light began to change, not dimming yet, but preparing to. Edith felt it before she saw it. The subtle tightening of space, the sense of approaching something enclosed. She folded her hands together, resting them in her lap, her fingers interlacing with quiet precision. "I've read about this," Marcus said. 6 miles through the mountain." 6 miles is a long time not to see where you're going," Sarah replied. Frank gave a low grunt. "Sometimes that's the only way through," he said. The train entered the tunnel. Darkness did not fall abruptly, but it arrived with certainty, swallowing the landscape in a single unbroken motion. The windows, once expansive, became mirrors. Reflections replaced views. The interior of the car turned inward, each face faintly doubled in the glass. The rhythm of the train intensified, echoing against the walls of the tunnel. It was louder now, more insistent, as though the motion itself had become aware of its confinement. Edith watched her reflection. It was clearer than before, framed by darkness. She saw the lines at the corners of her eyes, the softening of her jaw, the silver in her hair catching what little light remained. For a moment she did not look away. "This part always makes people quiet," Sarah said softly. "Nothing to look at but yourself," Marcus added. Frank shifted slightly. "Or what you've been carrying," he said. The words settled into the space between them. Edith felt something stir. Not discomfort exactly, but recognition. The tunnel, with its enforced stillness and absence of distraction, seemed to invite a kind of inventory, not of possessions, but of memories, of choices, of the quiet accumulations of a life. "What did you do before this?" Sarah asked Marcus, her voice gentle. He exhaled slowly. "I practiced law," he said. "Corporate, contracts, negotiations, mergers, years of it." "And now?" Edith asked. He smiled faintly. "Now I am trying to determine whether that was what I did, or who I was." Frank gave a small approving nod. "Takes guts to ask that question," he said. "What about you?" Sarah asked Frank. He hesitated just briefly. "Army," he said. "Long time ago. After that, I fixed things. Houses, engines, whatever needed it." "And the toolbox?" Edith asked quietly. Frank's hand moved to it almost unconsciously. "Some things you don't leave behind," he said. The train continued through the darkness, the sound of its passage steady and unwavering. Time felt altered here, stretched, thickened. Sarah turned to Edith. "And you?" she asked. "What did you do?" The question was simple, but it opened onto something larger. Edith considered her answer. "I kept a home," she said, for many years. And now? Marcus asked, echoing his own earlier question. Edith looked at her reflection once more. Now, she said slowly, I'm trying to understand what remains when that is no longer needed. No one spoke immediately. The train moved forward, unseen but certain. In the darkness, the boundaries between past and present seemed less distinct, as though time itself had softened. Edith felt the weight of her years, not as a burden, but as something tangible, something she could almost hold. The tunnel did not ask for answers, it simply required passage, and then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to recede. A faint light appeared ahead, growing steadily, drawing the eye forward. The reflections in the windows faded, replaced once more by the world beyond. The train emerged. The mountains opened around them, vast and illuminated, their peaks catching the late afternoon sun in sharp, brilliant lines. Snow traced their higher edges, a quiet reminder of seasons beyond the present one. The car seemed to breathe again. Passengers shifted, voices resumed, the rhythm of the train returning to its earlier cadence. Edith exhaled, unaware until that moment that she had been holding her breath. Light filled the space, yet even as the world outside expanded once more, something of the tunnel remained, not visible, not audible, but present. And as Edith watched the mountains unfold before her, a new question formed, quieter but more precise than before. If one must pass through darkness to see clearly, what exactly had she just begun to understand about herself, and what still remained hidden? Morning did not arrive all at once, but gradually, like a thought forming at the edge of awareness. The train had travelled through the night with quiet determination, carrying its passengers across unseen distances, through landscapes that existed only in darkness and memory. When Edith opened her eyes, the world beyond the window was pale and silvered, the first light of day brushing gently against the edges of the mountains. For a moment she did not move. There was a stillness in that early hour that felt almost sacred. The low hum of the train, the faint rattle of glass, the distant murmur of voices not yet fully awake. She became aware of the texture of the blanket folded beside her, the coolness of the window against her fingertips, and, faintly, the lingering scent of something warm, coffee perhaps, or toast carried through the corridor. She sat up slowly, adjusting her sweater, her movements careful, as though she might disturb the quiet if she moved too quickly. Outside, the landscape had shifted again. The wide plains of the previous day had given way to something more intricate. Ridges, valleys, the suggestion of water cutting through stone. Colorado, she thought. The name settled in her mind with a kind of quiet wonder. She had seen maps, of course, had traced routes with her finger in years past, but this unfolding, this presence, felt entirely different. It was not a place to be understood from a distance. It demanded attention. By the time she reached the dining car, the light had strengthened, turning the windows into bright frames for the world beyond. The tables were already partially filled, the familiar rhythm of morning underway, cups placed, utensils aligned, the soft clatter of dishes accompanied by the steady, reassuring cadence of the rails. The shared table policy was in effect once more, not as an inconvenience, but as a quiet invitation. Edith spotted them immediately. Frank sat as he had the day before, his posture firm, his wooden toolbox positioned carefully beside him, as though it too required a place at the table. Sarah leaned forward, her hair loosely gathered, her expression animated even in the early hour. Marcus sat with a cup of coffee in hand, a folded newspaper resting beside his plate, though he did not appear to be reading it. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice carrying a warmth that felt genuine rather than practiced. "Good morning," Edith replied, taking her seat. "Sleep well?" Marcus asked. "Well enough," she said. The movement helped. Frank nodded. "Train'll do that," he said. "Puts things in order." The waitress arrived, and orders were placed. Omelettes, bacon, coffee, the classics again, but there was comfort in repetition, in the small rituals that anchored day. Edith wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, feeling the heat seep slowly into her fingers. She inhaled, letting the scent rise, strong, slightly bitter, grounding. Outside, the landscape began to reveal itself more fully. The train entered Glenwood Canyon, and the effect was immediate. The world narrowed, not in confinement, but in focus. Towering rock walls rose on either side, their surfaces etched with time, their colours deepened by the slanting morning light. Below, the river moved with quiet persistence, reflecting fragments of sky and stone, its surface broken occasionally by ripples that caught the light like scattered glass. Sarah leaned closer to the window. "I never get used to this," she said softly. "It feels like the earth is remembering something." Frank glanced out, then back at his plate. "Or holding on to it," he said. Marcus followed the line of the river with his eyes. "Remarkable," he murmured, "that something so constant can still appear new." Edith did not speak. She watched. The canyon seemed to contain not just space, but time itself, layers of it, pressed into stone, visible and yet beyond comprehension. She felt suddenly the smallness of her own years against that vastness, and yet, at the same time, their weight. "Do you ever feel," Sarah said, turning back to the table, "that you've lived several lives already? That the person you were 20 years ago would not recognize you now?" Frank gave a short laugh. "I barely recognize who I was last week," he said. Marcus smiled faintly. "I recognize him," he said. "I'm just not certain I agree with him anymore." Edith considered the question. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have been many versions of the same person. Some I remember clearly, others feel like stories I was told." Sarah nodded, as though this made perfect sense. "My daughter says I'm reinventing myself," she said. "I told her I'm simply uncovering parts I had set aside." Frank gestured lightly with his fork. "Same difference," he said. "You're still the one doing it." There was a pause, not empty, but reflective. The food arrived, and for a time conversation gave way to the quiet focus of eating. The omelette was warm, the bacon crisp, the coffee refilled without request. The simple meal carried with it a sense of continuity, of something dependable in a world that had otherwise shifted. Edith found herself listening, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them. The way Frank's sentences often ended abruptly, as though he had said enough. The way Sarah filled silences with curiosity rather than discomfort. The way Marcus spoke with precision, but not rigidity, as though he were learning to allow for uncertainty. And beneath it all, the rhythm of the train, steady and unbroken. You know, Sarah said after a while, there's something about eating with strangers that makes people honest. Or careless, Marcus added. Or both, Frank said. Edith smiled. I think, she said, it makes people visible. The word lingered. Frank looked at her more directly than before. Were you invisible before? He asked, not unkindly. Edith held his gaze for a moment. I think, she said, choosing her words carefully, that I had become easy to overlook. Sarah's expression softened. That happens, she said, especially when you've spent years taking care of everything else. Marcus folded his hands. The world tends to prioritize what is loud, he said. Not necessarily what is present. Frank tapped the table lightly. Well, he said, you're here now. Simple, uncomplicated, and yet it settled into Edith with unexpected weight. The train continued through the canyon, the light shifting, the river bending, the mountains rising and falling in quiet succession. Time moved, but not hurriedly. There was space here, for thought, for memory, for something not yet defined. As the meal drew to a close and the plates were cleared, Edith felt a subtle shift within herself. Not a transformation, not even a decision, but a recognition. She was no longer entirely alone. Yet as she rose from the table, following the others back toward the observation car, a quiet question remained, threading itself through her thoughts like the river through the canyon. If being seen required nothing more than presence, why had it taken her so long to allow herself to be visible? The lounge car revealed itself gradually, not through announcement, but through atmosphere. It was warmer there, though not in temperature alone. The lighting was softer, amber-toned, casting gentle shadows that seemed to invite conversation rather than observation. A small bar occupied one end, its surface polished to a quiet sheen, while scattered tables and chairs created pockets of intimacy within the larger space. Edith hesitated at the threshold. There was laughter here, not loud but genuine. Glasses touched lightly, voices overlapped, not in competition, but in shared rhythm. It was a different kind of space from the observation car, less contemplative, more immediate. Come on, Sarah said, appearing beside her. This is where the stories hide. Frank was already there, seated near the bar, his toolbox tucked neatly beneath his chair. Marcus stood nearby, speaking with the attendant, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had begun to shed something unseen. Edith followed. They gathered at a small table, the four of them forming a shape that felt, if not yet permanent, then at least familiar. What'll you have? Sarah asked. Tea? Edith said. Of course, Sarah smiled. Balance for the rest of us. Frank ordered something stronger. Marcus hesitated, then did the same. The drinks arrived, and with them a subtle shift in the air. conversation loosening, edges softening. From somewhere behind the bar, music began to play. It was unmistakable. Fire and Rain by James Taylor, its opening notes familiar in a way that bypassed memory and went straight to something deeper. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. "Oh," she said, almost to herself. "That takes me back." Frank leaned back, listening. "Haven't heard this in years," he said. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "There's a clarity to it," he observed. "No excess, just truth." Edith felt something shift within her. The song did not belong to a specific moment in her past, and yet it carried the weight of many. Car rides, quiet evenings, a radio playing somewhere just beyond attention. It was not nostalgia in the sense of longing, but in the sense of recognition. "My husband used to play music while fixing things," she said, the words arriving before she had fully considered them. Not loudly, just enough to fill the space. Frank nodded slowly. "Best way to work," he said. Sarah leaned forward. "What kind of music?" "Whatever was on," Edith replied. "But sometimes this." The song continued, its melody weaving gently through the room, binding the present to something older, something shared. "My divorce was finalized to this song," Sarah said, not with sadness, but with a kind of quiet acceptance, not intentionally. It was just on. I remember thinking, well, that's fitting. Marcus gave a faint, ironic smile. "I spent years in conference rooms where music was considered a distraction," he said. "Now I find it explains more than most conversations ever did." Frank lifted his glass slightly. "Music doesn't pretend," he said. "People do." They sat with that. Around them, the lounge carried on. Soft laughter, the clink of glass, the murmur of voices blending into something indistinct yet comforting. The train moved steadily forward, its rhythm now almost indistinguishable from the pulse of the room. Edith sipped her tea, the warmth steady, grounding. She became aware suddenly of the ease with which she was sitting there, not performing, not adjusting, not measuring her words against an invisible standard. Simply present. "You know," Sarah said, "my son keeps telling me I should start an online gallery. Says that's how people see your work now." "And will you?" Marcus asked. Sarah smiled. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm not sure I want to be seen that way." Frank chuckled. "World's always telling you how to live," he said. "Half the trick is ignoring it." Edith glanced around the room. "And the other half?" she asked. Frank met her gaze. "Figuring out what you actually want," he said. The song drew to a close, its final notes lingering briefly before giving way to the quiet hum of the train once more. For a moment no one spoke. Then, from somewhere near the bar, a man laughed, a full, unrestrained sound that seemed to ripple outward, touching each table in turn. It was not directed at anything in particular, and yet it felt contagious, a reminder that joy could exist without explanation. Edith felt it then, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gentle unfolding. She was here. Not in memory, not in anticipation, but in the present, among people who, only hours before, had been strangers. And yet, As the train carried them deeper into the vastness of the country, and as the warmth of the lounge settled around them, a quieter thought began to take shape beneath the comfort. If connection could arise so easily in a place of passing, what might it reveal about the parts of her life where she had remained distant? And why had she believed for so long that it was too late to change that? The train slowed in a way that did not belong to schedule. At first it was subtle, the rhythm beneath their feet softening, the steady forward pull loosening into something hesitant. Edith felt it before she consciously registered it, her body now attuned to the language of motion and interruption. Conversations in the lounge thinned, not stopping entirely, but losing their momentum, as though the air itself had begun to listen. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled stop due to a technical issue ahead. We appreciate your patience." The words were calm, practiced, but they carried a weight that settled differently than the earlier announcements of meals and scenery. This was not part of the itinerary. This was something else, an interruption, an uncertainty. The train came to a full stop. Outside, the world was vast and unyielding. They had entered Utah some time earlier, though Edith had not marked the exact moment. Now the landscape stretched outward in muted tones, sand, stone, and sky blending into a horizon that seemed less like a line and more like a suggestion. The light was sharper here, less forgiving, illuminating everything without softness. "Utah dessert," Frank said, glancing out the window as though confirming a known fact. "Nothing out there but distance." Sarah leaned closer to the glass, her expression thoughtful rather than concerned. "It's beautiful," she said, "in a way that doesn't ask for approval." Marcus folded his hands on the table. "Or permission," he added. Time shifted. Minutes passed, though they did not accumulate in the usual way. Without movement, the train lost its forward narrative, and the present expanded, stretching into something that required attention rather than allowing it to drift. Edith felt it then, the absence of motion creating space for something else. "So," Sarah said after a while, her voice softer than before, "what do we do when things stop?" Frank gave a short breath, not quite a laugh. "Fix them," he said automatically, then paused. "If you can." "And if you can't?" Marcus asked. Frank did not answer immediately. "Then you wait," he said, "or you figure out what doesn't need fixing." The words lingered. Edith watched the landscape, her reflection faintly visible against the brightness outside. The stillness pressed gently against her thoughts, not demanding, but present. "My daughter calls me every Sunday," Sarah said, almost as though continuing a conversation that had begun elsewhere. "She has a schedule for everything. Yoga at 9, groceries at 11, dinner at 6. She says it helps her feel in control." "And does it?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," Sarah replied. "Sometimes she sounds tired, like she's running a life instead of living one." Frank shifted in his seat. "My son doesn't call," he said. "Not much anyway. Busy, work, kids, all that." He shrugged, but the motion was not entirely dismissive. "That's how it goes." Edith felt a tightening in her chest. not sharp, but familiar. My daughter calls, she said, but often to tell me what I should be doing, what I should learn, how I should keep up. She paused, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the table. I think she worries that I am falling behind. Marcus regarded her thoughtfully. And are you? He asked. The question was not accusatory. It was precise. Edith considered it. I don't know, she said. I feel as though the world has changed its language, and I have not yet learned to speak it. Sarah reached across the table, not touching Edith's hand, but resting her own near it. Maybe you don't need to, she said. Maybe you just need to decide which parts are worth learning. Frank nodded. World's always changing, he said. Doesn't mean you have to change with all of it. Marcus leaned back slightly. There is a difference, he said, between adaptation and erasure. One allows you to continue, the other asks you to disappear. The word lingered. Disappear. Edith looked out at the desert again. There was no movement there, no visible life, and yet it did not feel empty. It felt complete, self-contained. What if, she said slowly, life does not end after 60, but simply becomes something else we have not yet understood? Sarah smiled, not brightly, but with recognition. That sounds like the beginning of something, she said. Frank tapped the table once, thoughtfully. Or the middle, he said. People just think it's the end because they stop looking ahead. Marcus inclined his head. Perspective, he said. We are taught to see life as a line. Perhaps it is something closer to a landscape. The train remained still. Outside, the light shifted slightly, the angle of the sun changing, casting longer shadows across the ground. Time was moving, even if they were not. Edith felt something settle within her, not an answer, not even clarity, but a willingness to remain in the question. And as the silence stretched, filled not with emptiness but with shared presence, she realized that this interruption, this unexpected stillness, had done something the movement had not. It had made them speak. Yet, as she sat there, surrounded by people who were no longer entirely strangers, another thought began to form, quieter but more insistent than before. If life could pause without ending, what else might she have mistaken for a conclusion that was, in truth, only a waiting place? The train did not start again immediately. Even after the announcement that the issue had been identified, after the quiet movement of staff along the corridor, and the distant sounds of activity beyond the visible, there remained a lingering stillness, as though the train itself were considering the effort of continuing. Edith found herself back in her seat. The desert still stretched outside, though the light had shifted toward afternoon, softening at the edges. The interruption had altered something, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Conversations, once tentative, now carried a different weight, as though the shared pause had drawn them into a closer orbit. Frank sat across from her, his wooden toolbox resting on the small table between them. It had been there before, of course, but now it seemed to occupy more than physical space. It was no longer simply an object. It was a presence. You ever open it? Edith asked. Frank glanced at her, then at the box. "Not often," he said. "Why carry it then?" He rested his hand on the lid, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood, worn smooth in places, rough in others. "Habit," he said at first, then paused, "and memory." Marcus and Sarah joined them, settling into their seats with a familiarity that no longer required introduction. "What's in it?" Sarah asked, her tone curious but respectful. Frank hesitated. "Tools," he said. Sarah raised an eyebrow, smiling slightly. "I gathered that much." Frank exhaled, a quiet sound. "Things I used," he said. "Things I thought I'd need again." "And do you?" Marcus asked. Frank did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the toolbox. The lid creaked softly, the sound distinct in the quiet of the car. Inside, the contents were arranged with care: wrenches, screwdrivers, a small hammer, each placed in its own space, as though order itself were part of their function. But there were other things as well: a folded photograph, a small tarnished badge, an envelope, edges worn, its seal long since broken. Edith felt her attention drawn not to the tools, but to these quieter objects, the ones that did not belong to repair, but to memory. Frank lifted the photograph first. He did not hand it over immediately. Instead, he looked at it, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, the roughness in his features softening into something more reflective. "My wife," he said, "taken a long time ago." He passed it to Edith. The image was faded, the colours muted by time, but the woman's face was clear, young, smiling, caught in a moment that seemed both ordinary and significant. "She looks kind," Edith said. "She was," Frank replied. "Still is, I suppose, just not here." Sarah leaned closer. "What happened?" she asked gently. Frank closed the toolbox halfway, as though containing something. "Life," he said. "We grew in different directions. Didn't notice until we were already too far apart." Marcus nodded slowly. "That happens more often than people admit," he said. Frank picked up the badge next. It caught the light briefly before settling into his palm. "Army," he said. "Long time ago." He turned it over once, then placed it back. "And the envelope?" Edith asked quietly. Frank's hand paused. For a moment it seemed he might not answer. Then slowly he opened it. Inside was a letter, the paper yellowed, the handwriting careful, deliberate. "My son," he said, "from years ago." "Why keep it here?" Sarah asked. Frank looked at the letter, then at the toolbox. "Because I didn't answer it," he said. The words settled heavily. Edith felt a quiet shift within herself, not discomfort, but recognition. The idea of something left unresolved, something carried not because it was needed, but because it had never been completed. "What did it say?" Marcus asked. Frank hesitated, then unfolded the paper. "He wanted to know why I left," he said. "Why I chose work over being home. Why I was always fixing things for other people, but not for us." Sarah's expression softened. "And what would you say now?" she asked. Frank let out a slow breath. "I'd say I didn't know how," he said. "Didn't know how to be there without something to fix." Silence followed, not empty, but full. The train shuddered slightly, a subtle indication of movement returning, though it had not yet begun in earnest. The pause was ending. Edith looked at the letter. "Do you think," she said carefully, "that it is too late to answer it?" Frank met her gaze. "I don't know if he'd listen," he said. Marcus leaned forward. "That is not the same as whether you should speak," he said. Sarah nodded. "Sometimes," she said, "we say things not because we expect a reply, but because they need to be said." Frank folded the letter slowly, placing it back into the envelope, then into the toolbox. He closed the lid. The sound was soft but final. Outside, the train began to move again, almost imperceptibly at first, then with growing certainty. The desert shifted, no longer fixed, but passing once more, the horizon stretching forward. Edith felt the motion return beneath her, familiar now, reassuring. But something had changed. The toolbox was no longer just a collection of tools. It was a container of unfinished conversations, of questions left unanswered, of moments that had not yet found their conclusion. And as the train gathered speed, carrying them onward into the widening landscape, Edith found herself holding a thought that felt both unsettling and quietly hopeful. If some things were never repaired because no one had tried again, what might happen if they chose, now, after all this time, to begin? By the time the train gathered its full momentum again, something had shifted in the air, not visibly, not in a way that could be named outright, but in the subtle way people held themselves, as though the shared stillness in the desert had rearranged certain quiet truths within them. Edith noticed it first in the silences. They were no longer tentative. They had weight now, but also ease, like pauses between familiar sentences rather than gaps between strangers. The four of them found their way back to the observation car as the afternoon stretched into a softer light, the desert slowly giving way to more varied terrain, low ridges, distant mesas, a horizon that no longer felt quite so endless. Frank carried the toolbox differently, not just physically, though Edith noticed his grip was less rigid, but in the way he set it down beside him, no longer as something to guard, but something acknowledged. He did not open it again immediately. Instead, he sat with his hands resting loosely on his knees, watching the passing landscape with an attention that seemed for once unoccupied. Marcus had brought his book again, though it remained closed on his lap. Sarah leaned forward, sketchbook in hand now, though she did not draw continuously, only occasionally, as though capturing fragments rather than attempting to hold the whole. Edith sat between them, her gaze moving from the window to the people around her, and back again. The rhythm of the train returned fully, steady and grounding, but the memory of the stop remained, like a question that had not yet been answered. Frank spoke first. "I keep thinking about that letter," he said, his voice lower than usual, less declarative. No one rushed to respond. "What stops you?" Marcus asked eventually. Frank exhaled through his nose. "Time," he said. "Distance, pride." He paused. "All the usual things people use when they don't want to admit they're afraid." Sarah looked up from her sketch. "Afraid of what?" she asked. Frank did not answer immediately. Edith watched him, noticing the slight tightening in his jaw, the way his fingers curled inward briefly before relaxing again. "That it won't matter," he said at last, "that I'll say it, and it won't change anything." Marcus nodded slowly. "That is always a possibility," he said, "but silence guarantees the same outcome." Frank gave a short, humorless laugh. "Spoken like a man who's argued both sides of everything." Marcus allowed himself a faint smile. "I spent years doing precisely that," he said, "defending positions I did not believe in, simply because I was paid to." He paused, then added, "It becomes difficult after a while to distinguish between conviction and performance." Edith turned slightly toward him. "And now?" she asked. Marcus looked out the window. "Now I am attempting to live without an argument," he said. "It is unfamiliar." Sarah closed her sketchbook gently. "I think we all carry something like that," she said. "An unfinished conversation, a version of ourselves we never quite explained." Edith felt the words settle into her with unexpected clarity. She thought of the house, of the room she had left behind without truly saying goodbye, not to the walls, but to the life that had unfolded within them, of the quiet decisions made without witnesses, of the words she had never spoken aloud, even to herself. "I don't think I ever told my husband that I was afraid of being alone," she said, the admission arriving softly, almost as if it had been waiting. The others turned toward her, not with surprise, but with attention. "I think I assumed it would never be necessary," she continued, "that we would always be there, and now—" She let the sentence trail, not incomplete, but understood. Sarah reached across the small space between them, her hand resting lightly near Edith's. "Maybe some things are not meant to be said in the moment," she said gently. "Maybe they are meant to be understood later." Frank glanced at the toolbox. "And maybe some things are meant to be said, even if it's late," he added. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "The question," he said, "is not whether it will change the past. It is whether it might change the way you carry it." The train curved slightly, the light shifting across their faces, catching the lines of age not as flaws, but as evidence. Frank reached down, opened the toolbox again, and took out the envelope. This time his movements were less hesitant. He turned it over in his hands, as though reacquainting himself with its weight. "No return address," he said quietly, "just his name." Edith watched him. "Do you know where he is now?" she asked. Frank shook his head. "Last I heard, he moved west," he said, "somewhere past the mountains. Didn't say much after that." Sarah leaned back. "Then maybe this trip isn't just a trip," she said. "Maybe it's an opening." Frank gave her a look that might have been skepticism, but was not entirely dismissive. "You think I'm going to find him on a train ride?" he asked. "No," Sarah said. "I think you might find the part of yourself that's ready to look." Marcus nodded. "And that is where most journeys begin," he added. Frank looked down at the envelope again. Then, slowly, he slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Not back into the toolbox, Edith noticed. The gesture was small, almost inconsequential, but it carried a quiet significance, like a door left slightly ajar. Outside, the landscape continued to shift, the colours deepening as the afternoon moved toward evening. The desert was giving way to something more textured, more varied, as though the world itself were preparing for change. And as Edith sat there, watching Frank carry the letter not as a relic, but as a possibility, a question formed within her, one that felt both unfamiliar and strangely necessary. If the past could not be altered, but its weight could be shifted, what might she be carrying that no longer needed to remain where it was? Dinner arrived not as a necessity, but as a ceremony. The dining car, which had felt bright and practical in the morning, now held a different character altogether. The light had softened into a warm amber glow, and small candles, electric yet convincing in their quiet flicker, rested at the centre of each table, casting gentle halos that blurred the edges of everything they touched. Outside, the world had darkened into silhouettes, mountains reduced to shadow, the sky deepening into a vast indigo expanse. Occasionally, distant lights appeared and disappeared, like brief acknowledgments of life beyond the train. Inside, time slowed. The four of them were seated together again, the shared table no longer an arrangement, but a choice. Edith noticed the details more acutely in this light, the way the silverware reflected the flicker of the candles, the soft murmur of voices blending into a low continuous hum, the faint clink of glass punctuating the rhythm of the rails. There was something almost old-fashioned about it, something that resisted urgency. "This reminds me of dinners from years ago," Sarah said, her voice softer now, matching the atmosphere, before everything became rushed. Frank nodded. "Used to sit at the table every night," he said. "No distractions, just food and talk." Marcus adjusted his napkin with quiet precision. "Now," he said, "people dine with one eye on a screen and the other on the clock." Edith smiled faintly. "My husband insisted on no television during dinner," she said. "At the time it felt unnecessary. Now it feels rare." The waitress arrived and their orders were taken. The conversation paused briefly, then resumed, flowing more easily now, as though it had found its natural course. "You know," Sarah said, "I don't miss everything about the past, but I do miss the way time felt." "How did it feel?" Marcus asked. Sarah considered. "Wider," she said, "less divided into pieces." Frank took a sip of his drink. "Time's the same," he said. "People just feel it differently." Marcus tilted his head. "Or perhaps we measure it differently," he said, "by productivity instead of presence." Edith listened, her attention moving between their words and the quiet sensations around her, the warmth of the air, the steady movement beneath her, the soft glow of the candlelight. "I think," she said slowly, "that I spent many years believing that a full life meant a busy one." "And now?" Sarah asked. Edith looked at the small circle of light on the table. "Now I am not so certain," she said. The food arrived, and for a time conversation gave way to the quiet rituals of dining, cutting, tasting, passing, refilling. The candlelight softened everything, even the edges of thought, allowing words to emerge without force. After a while Marcus spoke again. "There is something I have not mentioned," he said. The tone of his voice shifted the atmosphere slightly, not dramatically, but enough to draw attention. "I spent most of my career working on a particular case," he continued. "A corporate acquisition involving a collection of historical assets, artifacts, documents, items of cultural value." Sarah leaned forward, her interest immediate. "What kind of artifacts?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, as though choosing how much to reveal. "One in particular stood out," he said. "A journal, late 19th century, belonged to a railway engineer, someone who worked on early transcontinental lines." Frank's attention sharpened. "A railroad man," he said. "What happened to it?" Marcus's expression grew more distant, not in detachment, but in recollection. "It disappeared," he said, "during the transition of ownership. Officially, it was listed as misplaced. Unofficially—" He paused. There were questions. "What kind of questions?" Edith asked quietly. Marcus met her gaze. "Whether it had been taken intentionally," he said, "whether someone believed it contained something more than historical notes." Sarah's eyes lit with curiosity. "Like what?" she asked. Marcus shook his head slightly. "No one knew for certain," he said, "but there were rumors that the journal described something hidden along the rail line. Not treasure in the conventional sense, but something significant." Frank leaned back, considering. "People have been chasing things like that for as long as there have been tracks," he said. "And yet," Marcus added, "this one was never found." The candlelight flickered softly. Edith felt a subtle shift within her. Not excitement exactly, but intrigue. The idea of something lost, something tied to the very path they were travelling, gave the journey an additional dimension, one that extended beyond the present. "Why are you telling us this now?" she asked. Marcus smiled faintly. "Because," he said, "I have reason to believe that the journal may not be as lost as it was assumed to be." Sarah leaned in. "You think someone on this train has it?" she asked, half in jest, half in possibility. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Frank's toolbox. Edith followed his gaze. The moment passed quickly, unnoticed by Frank, who had begun to cut into his meal with quiet focus. But Edith had seen it, and as the candlelight continued to flicker, and as the train carried them deeper into the night, a new layer of the journey revealed itself, not fully, not yet, but enough to alter the shape of what lay ahead. The conversation resumed, lighter now, as though the revelation had been tucked carefully beneath the surface. Yet it remained there, present, waiting, and as Edith sat within that circle of warmth and quiet illumination, she felt the story of their journey begin to expand, not only into the landscapes beyond the window, but into something hidden, something unresolved, something that might, if followed, lead them somewhere none of them had intended to go. But the question that settled most firmly in her mind was not about the journal, nor the possibility of its existence. It was something quieter, more personal, and far more immediate, if the past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. What else, within herself, within the others, was waiting just beneath the surface to be uncovered. Morning arrived in fragments, filtered through the pale light that gathered slowly along the edges of the world, as though dawn itself were reluctant to disturb what had been revealed the night before. Edith woke before the announcement, before the soft stirrings of other passengers, with the distinct sensation that something unfinished had followed her into sleep. For a moment she did not move. The memory of the candlelit dinner lingered, not in the words alone, but in the spaces between them, in the glance Marcus had allowed himself toward Frank's toolbox, in the way Frank had not noticed, or perhaps had chosen not to notice. There are moments, Edith thought, when truth does not arrive loudly, but stands quietly in the corner of a room, waiting to be acknowledged. She dressed slowly, her movements deliberate, grounding herself in small routines, the smoothing of fabric, the fastening of buttons, the familiar act of preparing for a day that, despite its unfamiliar setting, still required presence. When she stepped into the corridor, the train had already resumed its steady rhythm, as though the interruption in the desert had been folded neatly into his past. The landscape outside had changed again. The terrain had softened, the sharp austerity of the desert giving way to something more varied. Rolling stretches of land, scattered trees, distant elevations that suggested the approach of something larger. The air itself seemed different, though she could not have said precisely how. Perhaps it was only the light, gentler now, less severe. She found the others in the observation car. Frank sat by the window, the toolbox once again at his feet, though this time his posture carried a certain tension, as though he were aware, however faintly, of being observed. Marcus stood nearby, his book unopened, his attention not on the page, but on Frank himself, though discreetly, as though careful not to intrude too directly. Sarah sat cross-legged in her seat, sketchbook open, though her pencil rested idle in her hand. Edith joined them without announcement. "Morning," Sarah said softly, her voice matching the hour. "Good morning," Edith replied. Frank nodded but did not speak. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was not entirely easy either. It carried the residue of the previous evening, of questions left suspended rather than resolved. Marcus broke it, though not abruptly. "I have been thinking about what I mentioned last night," he said, his tone measured. "The journal." Frank's gaze remained fixed on the window. "People think about all kinds of things," he said. "Yes," Marcus replied, "but some thoughts persist." Sarah closed her sketchbook gently. "Are you suggesting something?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of care. "I'm suggesting," he said, "that objects carry stories, whether we acknowledge them or not, and sometimes those stories remain incomplete." Frank shifted slightly, his hand moving almost unconsciously toward the toolbox, resting there briefly before withdrawing. "Everything's incomplete," he said. "That's life." Edith watched him. There was a difference now in the way he spoke, not the blunt certainty of before, but something more guarded, as though he were choosing which parts of himself to reveal and which to keep contained. "What if," she said quietly, something you carried, belonged not only to you. Frank turned to her then, his expression not defensive, but searching. That depends, he said, on how it came to be carried. Marcus took a step closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance. The journal I mentioned, he said, was believed to contain more than personal notes. It was said to describe a series of markers along the rail line, locations that held significance not recorded elsewhere. Some believed it pointed to something hidden. Others thought it was simply the reflections of a man who spent too much time in solitude. Sarah tilted her head. "And what do you believe?" she asked. Marcus considered. "I believe," he said, "that history often hides in plain sight, and that what we dismiss as unimportant is sometimes what endures." Frank let out a slow breath. "And you think I've got it?" he said, not angrily, but with a quiet directness. Marcus met his gaze. "I think," he said carefully, "that you're carrying something you have not yet chosen to examine fully." The distinction was subtle but deliberate. Frank looked down at the toolbox. For a moment no one spoke. The train continued forward, the rhythm beneath them steady, unwavering, as though indifferent to the tension that had gathered in that small space. Then, slowly, Frank reached down and opened the box again. This time his movements were neither hesitant nor defensive. They were deliberate, as though he had arrived at a decision that had been forming long before this journey began. He moved aside the tools, the photograph, the badge, the envelope. Beneath them, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was something else. Edith felt her breath catch, not sharply, but with a quiet awareness. Frank unfolded the cloth. Inside was a small leather-bound book, worn but intact. Marcus did not move, but his attention sharpened. "Where did you get it?" he asked. Frank held the book in his hands, turning it once as though reacquainting himself with its weight. "Years ago," he said, "working on a place out west, old rail property. It was in a box of things nobody wanted. Papers, scraps, things people leave behind when they think they don't matter." "And you kept it," Sarah said. Frank nodded. "Didn't think much of it at the time," he said. "Just seemed worth keeping." Marcus stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "May I?" he asked. Frank hesitated. Then, after a moment, he handed the journal over. Marcus opened it carefully, as though aware that what he held was not simply an object, but a continuity of something older. The pages were filled with tight, deliberate handwriting, notes, sketches, measurements, observations. It was not immediately decipherable, but it carried a sense of intention, of someone who had been recording not for others, but for himself. "There are references here," Marcus said, scanning the page. "Coordinates, descriptions of terrain, mentions of markers." Sarah leaned in. "It's real, then," she said softly. Edith watched the exchange, but her attention was not on the journal alone. It was on Frank, on the way he sat now, his hands empty, his posture altered, as though something he had carried for years had shifted, not removed, but shared. "Why now?" she asked him gently. Frank looked at her. "Because," he said, I'm starting to think that carrying things alone doesn't fix them. The words settled into the space between them, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. Outside, the landscape continued to change, the horizon rising, the suggestion of mountains growing more distinct in the distance, and as the train moved forward, carrying them towards something not yet fully visible, Edith felt the quiet certainty that this journey, once defined by distance, had become something else entirely. Yet even as the journal passed from hand to hand, and even as the story it contained began to unfold, a quieter question remained, threading itself through Edith's thoughts with increasing clarity. If some burdens were never meant to be carried alone, what else in her own life had she mistaken for something she had to bear by herself? The day stretched onward with a quiet sense of anticipation, as though the train itself were aware that it was nearing something significant, not only in geography, but in experience. The air within the cars carried a subtle shift, a heightened attentiveness among passengers who had begun, whether consciously or not, to prepare for arrival. Edith felt it in the way people lingered longer by the windows, in the way conversations paused mid-sentence as the landscape outside demanded attention. By late afternoon, the mountains began to rise in earnest. The Sierra Nevada did not appear suddenly, but gathered themselves gradually along the horizon, their presence growing with each passing mile until they occupied not just the distance, but the entirety of the view. Snow traced their higher elevations, catching the light in sharp, brilliant contrast against the darker rock. The lower slopes were marked by forests, dense, shadowed, touched with the last colours of autumn, as though the season itself lingered there, reluctant to yield entirely to winter. The observation car filled quickly. Passengers moved with quiet urgency, drawn by the promise of the view. The leather seats creaked softly as people settled, the glass above them reflecting both sky and interior in layered reflections. Edith sat with the others, the journal now resting on the small table between them. It had been examined, not completely, but enough to reveal patterns, repeated references to specific locations, sketches of terrain that seemed to correspond, at least loosely, to the route they were travelling. "It's not a map in the traditional sense," Marcus said, turning a page carefully. "It's more interpretive, observations tied to place, but not always directly." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes moving between the page and the mountains beyond. "It feels like someone trying to capture something they couldn't quite explain," she said. Frank sat back, watching both the journal and the landscape with equal attention. "Or someone leaving a trail," he said. Edith rested her hands lightly on the table. "Do you think," she asked, "that it was meant to be found?" Marcus considered. "Perhaps not by everyone," he said, "but by someone willing to look closely." The train began its ascent, the motion subtly changing, the rhythm adjusting to the incline. The sound of the rails deepened, more pronounced now, as though the journey required greater effort. Outside, the light shifted again, the angle of the sun casting long shadows across the slopes, illuminating certain ridges while leaving others in quiet darkness. Sarah pointed toward the window. "Look," she said. A narrow pass opened between two ridges, the tracks curving gently through it, the path both visible and obscured at once. That could be one of the places, she said, her voice carrying a hint of excitement. Marcus glanced at the journal. There is a reference here, he said, to a divide where the light falls unevenly. It could be metaphorical, or it could be precisely this. Frank leaned forward slightly. And what would we be looking for? He asked. Marcus closed the journal gently. That, he said, is the question. Edith watched the mountains, their scale both humbling and invigorating. There was something about them, their solidity, their endurance, that made the concerns of everyday life feel, if not insignificant, then differently weighted. She thought of the house again, of the rooms she had left, the objects she had sorted, the decisions made quietly, without ceremony. She had believed at the time that she was closing something. Now she was less certain. Do you ever feel, she said slowly, that what we think of as endings are simply places where we stopped paying attention? The others turned toward her. Sarah smiled softly. That sounds like something worth painting, she said. Marcus inclined his head. Or worth reconsidering, he added. Frank looked out at the mountains again. Or worth going back to, he said. The train continued its climb, the landscape unfolding in increasingly intricate detail. Rock, snow, forest, shadow, light, each element distinct, yet part of something larger. The journal remained on the table, its presence now fully acknowledged, its mystery no longer hidden but not yet resolved, and as Edith sat there, surrounded by people who had begun as strangers and were becoming something else, something not easily defined, she felt the question that had followed her from the beginning of the journey take on a new form. Not whether it was possible to begin again, but how one recognized the moment when a beginning was already underway. And as the train moved deeper into the mountains, carrying them toward a destination that was no longer merely a place on a map, she found herself wondering if they followed the trail within the journal, would they discover something hidden in the landscape, or something within themselves they had not yet been willing to see? By the time the train wound higher into the mountains, the air inside the observation car had grown quieter, not from absence of sound, but from a kind of shared attentiveness that asked for less speaking and more seeing. The Sierra rose around them with increasing authority, their snow-lined ridges catching the late afternoon light in fractured brilliance, as though each peak held a slightly different version of the same day. Edith sat with the journal open before her, though she was not reading it in the conventional sense. Her eyes moved between the page and the world beyond the glass, searching not for exact correspondence, but for resonance, something that would connect the marks of ink to the shapes of stone. There, Sarah said softly, leaning forward. The train curved along a narrow ledge, revealing a stretch of terrain that seemed at once unremarkable and unmistakable. A ridge sloped downward into a shallow basin, its surface broken by scattered rock formations that caught the light unevenly, casting shadows that did not align with expectation. Marcus reached for the journal. There is a passage here, he said, his voice low, careful not to disrupt the fragile alignment between observation and recognition. It mentions a place where the sun hesitates, where shadow and light do not agree. Frank narrowed his eyes, studying the landscape. "Looks like every mountain I've ever seen," he said, though without dismissal. "No," Edith said quietly. The words surprised even her. She leaned closer to the window, her hand resting lightly against the glass, as though proximity might sharpen perception. "It's the angle," she said. "The light isn't falling evenly. It's interrupted." The others followed her gaze. There, near the edge of the basin, stood a formation, subtle, easily overlooked, a cluster of stones arranged not by chance, but not obviously by intention either. It did not declare itself. It simply existed, quietly distinct from the rest. Sarah's breath caught. "That's not natural," she said. Marcus turned the page again, scanning. "There is a symbol," he said, "a simple marking, 3 lines intersecting at uneven angles. It appears several times throughout the journal." Frank leaned forward. "Do you see it?" he asked. Edith did not answer immediately. She looked not only at the stones, but at the spaces between them, at the way the shadows fell, at the way the light seemed to hesitate just long enough to reveal a pattern. And then she saw it, not carved, not constructed, but implied. The arrangement itself formed the symbol. "It's there," she said. The train moved past the formation, the moment slipping behind them as quickly as it had arrived. For a brief instant, silence held them all, not empty, but charged. "Well," Frank said after a moment, leaning back, "if that's what we were supposed to find, it's not much." Marcus closed the journal slowly. "I do not think the purpose was the object itself," he said. "I think it was the act of seeing." Sarah nodded. "Of noticing," she added. Edith remained still, her gaze lingering on the place where the formation had disappeared from view. There had been no treasure, no hidden compartment, no secret revealed in the conventional sense, and yet something had been uncovered, not in the landscape, but in the way they had looked at it, together, attentively, without assumption. "My husband used to say," Edith said slowly, "that the difference between a house and a home was not the structure, but the attention you gave to it." Frank gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Same goes for most things," he said. Marcus rested his hand lightly on the journal. "This," he said, "may not have been a map to something hidden. It may have been a guide to how to see what was already there." Sarah smiled softly. "A reminder," she said, "that meaning isn't always buried. Sometimes it's simply overlooked." The train continued its passage through the mountains, the light beginning to soften as evening approached, the shadows lengthening, the contrast deepening. Edith felt something settle within her. Not resolution, not closure, but a quiet realignment. She had come on this journey expecting movement, distance, perhaps even distraction. Instead, she had been given something far less tangible and far more enduring, a way of seeing. And as the mountains unfolded around them, vast and unhurried, a new understanding began to take shape, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition. Perhaps the question was never whether life could begin again, but whether one had been paying attention to the beginnings all along. The descent from the mountains carried with it a subtle shift, not only in elevation, but in atmosphere. The air inside the train felt lighter, though not empty. Conversations resumed more freely, laughter returned in gentle currents, and yet beneath it all remained the quiet awareness that something was drawing to a close. San Francisco was no longer an abstract destination. It was approaching. Edith felt it not as anticipation alone, but as a kind of reckoning. Journeys, she thought, are measured not only by where they take you, but by what they leave behind, and what they ask you to carry forward. The four of them gathered once more in the dining car, though the formality of earlier meals had softened into something more intimate, more unstructured. The shared table policy had long since ceased to feel like a rule. It had become, instead, a quiet foundation upon which something unexpected had been built. Frank set his toolbox down beside him, but not with the same guarded precision as before. It rested there easily, as though it had been integrated into the moment rather than set apart from it. Sarah folded her scarf loosely around her shoulders, her expression reflective rather than animated. Marcus placed the journal on the table, though it remained closed, its presence acknowledged without the need for constant examination. Edith looked at each of them in turn, not as strangers, not even as acquaintances, but as people who had, in the span of a few days, revealed parts of themselves that might otherwise have remained hidden for years. "So," Sarah said softly, "what happens when we get off?" Frank let out a quiet breath. "We go our separate ways," he said. "That's how it works." Marcus inclined his head slightly. "Perhaps," he said, "but separation does not necessarily imply disconnection." Sarah smiled faintly. "You always did know how to make things sound more hopeful than they are," she said. Marcus returned the smile. "Or more accurate," he replied. Edith considered the question. "What happens when we get off?" It lingered, not as a logistical concern, but as something deeper. "I think," she said slowly, "that we continue." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Continue what?" he asked. Edith met his gaze. "Whatever began here," she said. The simplicity of it seemed to settle over the table. Sarah nodded. "I like that," she said. "Not ending, continuing." Frank looked down briefly, then back up. "I might try to find my son," he said, not loudly, not as a declaration, but as a possibility spoken aloud for the first time. Marcus's expression softened. "And I," he said, "may finally choose something that does not require justification." Sarah laughed lightly. "I'm going to paint something I don't understand again," she said, "but this time I won't try to explain it afterward." They all looked to Edith. She felt the weight of their attention, but it did not press on her. It held her. "I think," she said, "I will open the phone my daughter gave me." Frank chuckled. "Careful," he said. "That's how it starts." Edith smiled. "Not to keep up," she added, "but to choose what I wish to learn." Marcus nodded approvingly. "On your terms," he said. "On my terms," she echoed. The train moved steadily onward, the landscape outside shifting once more. mountains giving way to gentler terrain, the suggestion of water appearing in the distance, the light softening into the early hues of evening. Time, which had stretched and folded throughout the journey, now seemed to gather itself again, preparing for transition. And yet, as Edith sat there, surrounded by people who had become something meaningful in ways she could not fully articulate, she realized that what mattered was not the ending of the journey, but the continuation of what it had revealed. Still, as the train drew closer to its final destination, one last question emerged, not with urgency, but with quiet persistence. When one arrives somewhere new, how does one ensure that the self who steps off the train is not the same one who first boarded it? The train did not announce its arrival with grandeur. Instead, it approached the city with the same quiet persistence that had carried it across plains, through mountains, and over distances both visible and unseen. The light of early evening settled over the landscape, soft and diffuse, as though the day itself were easing into its conclusion with deliberate care. San Francisco revealed itself gradually, not as a sudden skyline, but as a layering of elements, water catching the last light of the sun, hills rising gently beyond it, buildings emerging one by one, their shapes defined not by height alone, but by presence. Edith stood by the window, her hand resting lightly against the glass, feeling the familiar vibration of the train beneath her fingertips, for what she knew would be the last time. There was no single moment when the journey ended. It simply arrived. The announcement came, polite and measured. "We will be arriving shortly." Passengers began to gather their belongings, movements taking on a renewed sense of purpose. Bags were lifted, coats adjusted, conversations briefly resumed or gently concluded. Edith returned to her seat. Her suitcase was where she had placed it days before, unchanged in appearance, though it seemed somehow lighter. Frank lifted his toolbox, holding it not as something burdensome, but as something chosen. Sarah adjusted her scarf, her eyes bright, though reflective. Marcus picked up the journal, then paused, looking at it for a moment before turning to Frank. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Frank shook his head. "Not any more," he said. "I think it belongs to the road." Marcus considered this, then nodded. He placed the journal on the table between them. "Then perhaps it belongs to whoever is willing to see," he said. Sarah smiled. "Or to the next person who needs it," she added. Edith looked at the journal. For a brief moment she considered taking it, not out of ownership, but out of curiosity. Then she realized something important. She did not need it. What it had shown them was no longer contained within its pages. The train slowed. The rhythm beneath them softened, then steadied into something final. Doors would open soon. They stood together, not formally, not ceremoniously, but naturally, as people do when something shared has reached its natural pause. "Well," Frank said, his voice carrying a quiet weight, "this is it." Sarah shook her head slightly. "No," she said, "it's not." Marcus glanced at her, then at the others. "She is right," he said. "This is not an ending. It is a transition." Edith felt the truth of it settle within her. She looked at each of them. Frank, with his steady presence and unfinished letter. Sarah, with her openness and rediscovered laughter. Marcus, with his thoughtful reconsideration of a life long defined by structure. And then she looked at herself, not as she had been when she boarded in Chicago, careful, uncertain, quietly convinced that she had already lived the greater part of her life, but as she was now, present, aware, open. The doors opened. A rush of cooler air entered the train, carrying with it the scent of the city, salt, metal, something distant and alive. Passengers began to step down, one by one, each carrying their own version of the journey within them. Edith paused at the threshold. For a moment she allowed herself to feel it fully, not the end, but the continuation, the quiet expansion of something that had begun not with certainty, but with a single step. She turned once more. The train remained behind her, still, patient, as though ready to carry others through their own crossings. Frank stepped down beside her. Sarah followed. Marcus came last, pausing briefly before joining them. They stood together on the platform, not speaking immediately, allowing the moment to exist without interruption. Then, without ceremony, without promises they could not guarantee, they parted, not abruptly, not reluctantly, but with the quiet understanding that something meaningful does not require constant proximity to endure. Edith walked forward. The city opened before her, not as something to be navigated, but as something to be entered. She reached into her bag and, after a moment's hesitation, took out the small box her daughter had given her. The phone. She opened it. The screen lit up, unfamiliar, bright, waiting. Edith did not rush. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its possibility, and then, carefully, deliberately, she began, not to keep up, not to catch up, but to step forward. And as she moved into the evening, the question that had followed her across the country did not disappear. It changed, no longer asking whether it was possible to begin again, but something quieter, more certain. What, now, would she choose to begin?